I got a call from the police saying my daughter was in an accident and had been rushed to the hospital. When I told my mother-in-law about it, just as she was about to leave for a trip, she said, "I don't care about that failure of a granddaughter. Just don't mess up my trip." Her unexpected words left me completely shocked. Why does she dislike my daughter so much? 3 days later, when my mother-in-law came back from her trip, it seemed like she didn't care about my daughter at all. In fact, she was even humming happily about delivering souvenirs to her beloved niece. But she didn't know the real whereabouts of that niece. When I opened up and told her a certain truth, she accused me of making up stories and went berserk. Still, I calmly continued to tell her the truth. Then, my daughter revealed a truth that no one knew. As a result, my mother-in-law's remaining years took an unbelievable turn. I'm in my late 30s and married. I met my husband, who's in the same age group as me, through mutual friends. I wanted to keep working after getting married, and he supported my dream to juggle work and parenting. As promised, I managed to work almost until I gave birth. Thanks to my husband's support, I was able to achieve goals at work, and my daughter grew up well. Recently, she's shown interest in cooking and often helps me when I'm off work. Our family of 3 wasn't exactly the typical household, but we were making it work and I thought we were content. However, when my daughter turned 11, my father-in-law passed away. It was colon cancer. My father-in-law was the type to endure pain silently, and by the time he sought medical help, it was too late. It seems the doctor advised him to live without regrets, but he passed away so quickly that there was no time for any action. We were all absent-minded by the sudden loss of my father-in-law. My husband, worried about his mother, suggested we bring her to live with us. I thought it would be more reassuring to have my mother-in-law at home rather than leaving my daughter alone. Besides, I couldn't possibly refuse my husband's request after he had always respected mine. So, we took in my mother-in-law and demolished the old family home to sell the land. The money earned from this was invested for my mother-in-law's future, something we had agreed upon with my sister-in-law. However, living with my mother-in-law was fraught with tension from the start. At my job, the rule is to finish work on time without overtime. But paperwork and deadlines at the end of the month often meant staying late. Dinner during these times was usually something quick, like frozen meals. Sometimes, my daughter would prepare stew or curry, but I never asked her to prepare dinner regularly since she also wanted to play with her friends. My husband had no complaints, such end-of-month dinners were common in our house. But my mother-in-law did not approve. "You're neglecting our growing daughter's development. You're being lazy in managing your husband's health with these easy meals." She even went as far as to suggest that I was intentionally ruining my own health with high-calorie meals. At first, I would apologize and take a humble approach, but after 6 months, I started feeling resentful. I wouldn't mind if my mother-in-law prepared dinner. Mom works just like Dad, so it's not fair to criticize her for the meals. If it's okay for Dad, why isn't it okay for Mom? It seems that at school, they're teaching about gender equality and to stop the mindset of because you're a woman or because you're a man, and my daughter pointed out how wrong her grandmother's way of thinking was. Previously, she would say, "It's okay, Mom, you're busy," but now she's confidently questioning and willing to listen to my mother-in-law's views too. My husband and I were touched to see our daughter's growth, but it seemed to bother my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law started to dislike my daughter for speaking her mind. She called my daughter a failure and useless, preferring only her niece of the same age. Whenever my mother-in-law spoke ill of my daughter, she did it loud enough for her to hear, which deeply hurt her. My daughter spent some time cooped up in her room, feeling really down. It's been a year since we began living with my mother-in-law. But our relationship is still at an impasse with no sign of improvement. My daughter avoids being alone with her grandmother, and my mother-in-law blames me, saying, "You're at fault for raising such an unaffectionate daughter. The cause is all on you." Although I felt a deep dislike for my mother-in-law, the fact that she didn't linger around the house and often spent time out using the money my father-in-law left behind was the only saving grace. She usually said she was going out for tea with friends and would be back at a certain time, so I just watched the clock and told myself to endure until then. One day, she began packing a brand new suitcase. It was filled with clothes and cosmetics, and I thought she might finally be leaving our home. Turned out, she was actually going on a spa trip with her friends. The plan seemed to have been made suddenly, and she babbled on about rushing to buy the suitcase, sharing details I didn't ask for. My mother-in-law's sudden outings like this, especially when she would be away for a few days, were a welcome respite for our family. I was all set to happily see her off, thinking, please, go ahead and enjoy yourself. However, at that time, I was growing increasingly anxious because my daughter hadn't returned home even though it was past the time she was supposed to. She should have been home early from school that day. I always told her to come home first before going out to play. It seemed unlikely that my daughter would leave a message with my mother-in-law, but there was a chance she might have contacted her without my knowledge. I asked my mother-in-law if there was any message from my daughter. Maybe she's tired of pretending to be a daughter who understands you and has run off somewhere. She said something to stoke my anxiety and then laughed creepily. Recently, I had learned to ignore my mother-in-law's snide remarks, but this time, she was not only targeting me but also my daughter, so I couldn't hold back and retorted. You really enjoy irritating others, don't you? Keep up this attitude, and no one will be there to help when you're in trouble. Me, in trouble? That'll never happen. How dare you talk back to your elder, such a cheeky woman. It's because she copies this behavior from you that I dislike my granddaughter. She has no charm. Charmless? That would be you. There's nothing worse than a bitter old person. I responded, feeling annoyed inside. Just then, the house phone rang. I shifted my focus and answered, only to hear from the police that my daughter had been in an accident. In a panic, I informed my mother-in-law, who was getting ready to leave for her spa trip. But she just said, I don't care about that good-for-nothing granddaughter, and left for her trip. I tried contacting her multiple times, but couldn't reach her until she returned home 3 days later. As soon as she got back from her spa trip, she started pulling out several souvenirs from her travel bag, cheerfully saying she bought them for her niece and was going to deliver them right away. She cheerfully mentioned that she had bought lots of gifts for her niece and was about to go deliver them. After getting ready to visit her niece, my mother-in-law, in a buoyant mood, called my sister-in-law. Considering she had been informed about my daughter's accident before her trip, shouldn't she at least inquire about the follow-up? It seemed as though my daughter didn't exist in her world, leaving me speechless. If only my mother-in-law had asked about my daughter, it would have been easier to convey an important truth. I missed the opportunity to tell her a crucial truth that she needed to know. Oblivious to my turmoil, my mother-in-law kept trying to call my sister-in-law, but couldn't get through, which she found odd. Strange, she's not answering her cell or home phone. I then told her the reason. 3 days ago, your granddaughter passed away. My mother-in-law raised her voice, disbelieving the news. You're just saying this to harass me, aren't you? Using someone's death as a joke, what a terrible daughter-in-law you are. I insisted again that it was no harassment, niece had indeed died in an accident. My mother-in-law refused to believe it, saying she was told my daughter was the one in the accident. Indeed, my daughter had an accident and fractured a bone, but her life was not in danger. That day, after school ended early, my daughter and a few friends, including niece, stopped by a park. Despite my instructions to come straight home, my daughter explained she didn't because she had a friend who wouldn't be able to play with her if she went home first. That friend was busy with some kind of daily lessons, so the only time they could play together was during school commutes. Niece loved climbing high places, and while playing on a climbing structure, she slipped and fell headfirst from the top. Passers-by in the park kindly called an ambulance, but she was unconscious from a bad fall. I tried contacting you multiple times since then. My calls weren't blocked, and the phone rang properly. You didn't answer because it was from me, right? But didn't you think something was wrong with the unusually persistent calls? My mother-in-law was unresponsive as I spoke. It was likely something my mother-in-law was aware of. She probably thought, just ignore it, it's only a call from her. She likely never imagined that her malice would lead to something so serious. I pressed on, revealing another harsh truth. Another truth was that the funeral had already taken place. My sister-in-law and her husband had to make the decision since they couldn't reach my mother-in-law. There was a suggestion to conduct only the wake initially and wait for my mother-in-law's return for the funeral. However, due to the significant emotional impact on the children who were present and my sister-in-law's strong will, they proceeded with a one-day funeral without her. The children are still receiving care for their emotional well-being. Saying goodbye to niece might help them find some closure. I agreed with this approach. My sister-in-law was beginning to feel angry at my mother-in-law for stubbornly ignoring my attempts to contact her. My sister-in-law, clinging to niece's body, wept, saying that my mother-in-law only showed affection when it suited her and was useless when truly needed. She was partly driven by despair, questioning why she should even allow such a person to attend the funeral. Supported by her husband, my sister-in-law had managed to maintain composure until the end of the funeral, but when it came to the departure, she broke down, crying that she should be buried with niece, fearing her niece would be lonely going to heaven alone. As I told this to my mother-in-law, she yelled, "Quiet! Stop making up stories. I haven't heard anything from my daughter. Just because your daughter is disliked, do you need to concoct such elaborate tales?" My mother-in-law seemed determined to believe it was all a fabrication on my part. I explained that given her current mental state, my sister-in-law likely couldn't muster the energy to answer the phone. My husband had mentioned that my sister-in-law's husband was devotedly by her side. My sister-in-law's smartphone became unusable after she dropped it in shock upon being informed of niece's death. Given her current state, I doubt she has the capacity to think about getting it repaired. Furthermore, she probably never wants to see my mother-in-law again. Finally, it seemed my mother-in-law realized that everything I had told her was the truth. "Why did my dear granddaughter have to go first? Why is your daughter still alive?" She lamented, blaming her regretful actions on my daughter and spewing her anger. She then locked herself in her room and didn't come out for the entire day. Since niece's passing, laughter had vanished from our home. My daughter was deeply blaming herself, believing it was her fault for not keeping the promise to return home first. It's a matter of what ifs, but indeed, if my daughter had gone home first as I told her, perhaps niece's fall might not have happened. Going straight home from school without any detours was a request and a promise that was emphasized by the school my daughter attends. However, how many children actually kept that promise? In fact, there had been times before when my daughter had made detours, but I refrained from being too strict about it and turned a blind eye. Both my husband and I comforted my daughter, assuring her that it wasn't her fault. Moreover, my sister-in-law's husband also told my daughter not to blame herself, saying it wasn't solely her fault. Despite this, our home couldn't return to its usual state filled with laughter. Concerned about my daughter's well-being, I had taken time off work, but my husband had to return the day after the funeral. Usually, my daughter would greet him when he came home, but she didn't have the energy for that yet. When my husband returned, he understood the situation just by looking at my face. It had been a week since my daughter started refusing to go to school. Actually, since niece's death, there are other children too shocked to attend school. My husband and I decided to watch over our daughter and wait until she feels ready to go to school on her own. After sending my husband off, I contacted my workplace to request an extension of my leave. By the second week, my boss's tone had grown heavier. While he didn't say no, his hesitant response made me feel that further absence could change the atmosphere at work. Still, I believed prioritizing my daughter was the right thing to do at this time. At noon that day, I prepared lunch for my daughter and my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law said things like, "I don't want to eat," or "I'll eat if I feel like it," so I decided to just leave her portion outside her room. She had stopped showing up at the dining table when my husband wasn't there, saying she didn't want to see the faces of my daughter or me. My husband said to just leave her be, so I did. However, with my daughter, I couldn't do the same. Sometimes, if she didn't come out of her room, I would insist she eat at least a bit, even in a stern tone. But on this day, she surprisingly came out of her room quickly, as if she was about to leave her room even before I called her. She seemed to be coming out of her room even before I called her. "Mom, look at this." When our eyes met, she showed me several letters she was holding in her hand. In her hand, she held several letters, which she found in the pocket of a pair of pants in her closet. My daughter used to favor wearing pants, but recently, inspired by her favorite model, she preferred skirts or shorts. That's why she hadn't noticed the letters before. She asked me to read them. The sender of the letters was my niece, who had passed away. My relationship with my sister-in-law was neither particularly close nor distant. We maintained a comfortable distance. Given that my daughter and niece were close, we used to have family interactions, especially when my father-in-law was alive. However, once we took in my mother-in-law, who began to differentiate between niece and my daughter, my sister-in-law's family started to keep their distance. The letters contained heartfelt pleas from niece to my mother-in-law, asking her not to speak ill of my daughter. Niece loved my daughter and wanted my mother-in-law to see her good qualities too. When niece visited our home, she wanted to play happily with my mother-in-law and my daughter. Every letter reflected her earnest wish for the repair of the relationship between my mother-in-law and my daughter. It seemed niece was aware that my mother-in-law unfairly disliked my daughter. "My grandma always says mean things to me when I played with her. Every time, she used to defend me, but grandma never stopped," my daughter told me in tears, revealing the complex relationship between the young children and my mother-in-law. On that day, we were playing in the park. Grandma came and said to me, my daughter recounted. "She told me not to come home until it gets dark. She said that when I return, she would tell you that I broke our promise and took a detour. Then, she took a keychain that my daughter cherished from her backpack and threw it high up, where it got stuck at the top of the playground equipment. My daughter, who was afraid of heights, couldn't retrieve it, so my niece climbed up to get it, leading to the accident. My daughter, trying not to worry me, had been silently enduring harassment from my mother-in-law and confiding in niece about it. My niece had been greatly distressed by the situation. If I remember correctly, on the day of my daughter's accident, my mother-in-law had suddenly decided to go on a spa trip. She must have seen the girls on their detour and played a childish prank. Moreover, my daughter also apologized for lying about how she fractured her bone. Initially, she said it happened while playing with a ball. I had believed her explanation, thinking it was just a sprained finger since she was absorbed in playing and felt only a little pain. But in reality, it was a fracture caused when she was pushed while trying to protect her backpack from my mother-in-law. As my daughter opened up about this, my husband returned from work, asking if it was true. He had left work early, worried about our daughter. As we were about to go inside, it seemed my mother-in-law had overheard the conversation about niece's letters from outside. My husband was disheartened that such things had happened without us knowing and grew angry at my mother-in-law's cruel and selfish behavior. It's hard to say, but niece's fall might have been initiated by my mother-in-law's petty harassment. My sister-in-law probably knew the truth. Witnesses aren't limited to just the children. Someone who was walking by called for help and might have seen my mother-in-law's malicious actions and reported the cause of the accident to the police. Being the victim's mother, she had the right to know, and likely learned the truth after demanding answers. That's probably why she resisted having my mother-in-law at the funeral. When the full story was revealed, suddenly, we heard crying. Turning towards the sound, we saw my mother-in-law coming out of her bedroom, crying like a child. "I didn't mean to be sneaky. I just came out to use the bathroom and heard you talking about my deceased granddaughter, so I got curious." My mother-in-law hadn't known that niece felt that way. She said she couldn't keep moping around for niece's sake. She needed to move forward and live longer for her. Approaching my daughter, she said, "From now on, I will show you affection too. After all, you're the child my dear granddaughter sacrificed herself to save." Her words seemed very off, so I thought it was risky to react hastily and chose not to. My husband scolded her, saying niece and our daughter are not her dress-up dolls. His analogy made me realize something. My mother-in-law's way of doting on niece was like a child cherishing a dress-up doll. She would dress her in clothes of her own liking, give her things she thought would make her happy, and then insist on her happiness. She was sad that her precious doll was broken. But while my daughter may not compare to that cherished doll, she seemed to think having her is better than having no doll at all. It was as if my daughter was being used as a substitute for niece. "Grandma, you know that people who have passed away don't come back, right? There's no such thing as a substitute for someone who's gone. Life, you know, is a unique existence. A priest who read the Bible taught me that. Grandma, you've lived longer and know so much, but you don't understand the value of a person's life." Then my daughter added this. "Niece lives on in our hearts. So maybe she should try to get along with her grandmother to fulfill niece's wish. But she definitely doesn't want to be loved as a replacement for niece." After that, the whole family found out that my mother-in-law's childish behavior led to niece's tragic accident, isolating her completely. My daughter seemed to understand the essence of life and death. Come to think of it, I was greatly comforted by the priest's sermon as well. People who came to my niece's funeral must have been comforted just like my daughter and me. The priest was very kind and spoke in a way that even young children could understand. Later, my husband decided to end the living arrangement with my mother-in-law and arranged for her to move into a nursing home. She resisted, saying it was too early to be called elderly. My husband firmly told his mother-in-law that she needed to leave our home. He said she could do as she pleased afterwards, but she shouldn't expect any financial support from us, except for expenses related to moving into a nursing home. When he stated he wouldn't provide financial aid for anything else, she begged him to reconsider, pleading that she would change her ways and not to kick her out of the house. The money from the sale of the family home, which was intended for her future needs, hadn't been touched yet. However, she had been recklessly spending it, assuming it was her money and that my husband would take care of her. My husband decided that he was willing to pay some out-of-pocket expenses for his mother's nursing home admission. He also mentioned that he had no intention of covering any expenses beyond what was needed for her nursing home admission. He had also said that he was tired of being asked about the money all the time, which was a major reason for his decision. I was very much in favor of the decision my husband had made. So, even when my mother-in-law clung to me, saying I was the only person she could rely on, I did not listen and busily carried her belongings outside. Resigned to being evicted from our home, my mother-in-law asked me to find her a job. My mother-in-law had never worked outside the home since her marriage. She believed that a woman's happiness lies in getting married, having children, and raising them. Honestly, I couldn't think of any job that would suit someone with such point of views. However, a contact of mine was looking for good personnel. I introduced her, though I doubted she would fit in, especially as she had been fussing about not being treated as an old person. Despite her previous desperate pleas to my husband and me, my mother-in-law's attitude completely changed once she secured a job. "I don't need your help. I'm still young, and I'll do well in this new environment and prove you wrong." Despite her grand statements, my mother-in-law gave up just 3 days into her new job. "Please, let me come back home. I can't handle it, that place is like hell. I can't stay there for a minute." "Mother-in-law, do you remember the agreement we made? For the sake of the person who referred you, you promised to work there for at least 6 months, right? Giving up in just 3 days is embarrassing for an adult, isn't it?" Since my mother-in-law insisted she wasn't old yet, I had arranged for her a job as a helper in a nursing home. I knew from acquaintances that it was a tough, dirty, and smelly job with high turnover. As a helper, she'd have to do a lot of menial tasks. My mother-in-law complained, "I just can't handle excreting." I knew this job wasn't suitable for her, and partially I arranged it to teach her a lesson, so this outcome was expected. I couldn't help but laugh when my mother-in-law behaved exactly as I had imagined. She was furious, saying it's wrong to laugh at someone's misfortune, but after all the mental distress she had caused, it seemed only natural that her actions would catch up with her. I ended the call with her and blocked her number. After that, there were no more calls from her. I've heard reports that my mother-in-law quietly slipped away from the nursing home I had arranged for her. Occasionally, I've spotted an elderly woman resembling my mother-in-law. She roams around carrying 3 paper bags, her hair unkempt, oddly wearing a winter coat despite it being early summer. Emitting a foul smell, she causes people to keep their distance. I thought our eyes met briefly, but I quickly averted my gaze and left. The entire family acts as if she doesn't exist. And we're no different. I've heard that my sister-in-law is gradually regaining her liveliness. I hope she'll return to society slowly and without pressure. My daughter has started going to school on her will and is now playing with friends again. I've returned to work, managing both home and job without any strain. We've promised to live our lives to the fullest for my niece's sake. We intend to keep striving for even more happiness.